Hi, everyone, and welcome to In Deep Geek Live. Today, we are having another look at this book. This book. It's something we looked at last week, but today we're going to take a slightly different view at it. We're going to try and look at the symbolism within Fire and Blood. What is it that we can learn from Fire and Blood that we can apply across to Game of Thrones and A Song of Ice and Fire? And as chance would have it, we have got the person that I would consider to be the greatest expert we have in this community on symbolism within A Song of Ice and Fire. So, guys, if you're a regular on this channel, you will already know this man. If you don't, you're in for a treat. But LML, do you want to say hi?
Of course I do, and thanks for inviting me on, Robert. It's always a pleasure. It's always my heart always goes pitter-patter when I see a little message from you. Hey, LML, you want to? Oh, yes, I'm there. And luckily, I happen to have Thursdays off right when you broadcast. So, but I must protest. I'm not here to talk about the book that you just held up. I'm here to talk about this book. It's called Fire and Blood, and it's got a picture of a three-headed dragon on the front. I'm not sure what you were just holding up, but...
Well, I don't know, guys. In the chat, I suspect that I think this is a better cover, but
I think I have
be the judge of it. That's absolutely fine. I am very happy that I'm on this side of the Atlantic and I got the cool cover. But guys, as always, the way that we're going to run this is I've had a whole load of questions from my patrons that I'm going to be running through. But this is a Q&A session. This is a matter of us just answering whatever you want to throw at us. So first of all, though, I want to say a huge thank you to Maura Leaf, who before we even went live did a super chat for $50. Maura, that is incredibly generous. Thank you so much. There was no question attached, just a donation. So thank you. I really appreciate it. But LML, why don't you just kick us off with your big picture thoughts on this? What's the sort of the big takeaways that you'd have from Fire and Blood?
Well, I'd have to say the first thing that strikes me is that this was a lot more enjoyable read than any of the edited versions of this material that we've gotten. In the World of Ice and Fire, we got a very, very condensed version of the entire Targaryen history, which was, basically Elio and Linda working with most of this Fire and Blood source material. Just in case anyone doesn't know, most of this material was written by George while he was writing the World of Ice and Fire. He started writing little sidebars and ended up with 300,000 pages of Targaryen history. And so Elio and Linda, hang on a second. Elio and Linda were working with that material when they came up with the sort of condensed summaries in the World of Ice and Fire with George that they did. And then in The Princess and the Queen, we got the Dance of the Dragons, Targaryen Civil War story, but it was still edited, still with a lot of bits chopped out. And then in Sons of the Dragon, we got the Aenys and Maegor story, but again, condensed. So this book was, basically right off the pen, the way George wrote it. And it was a lot more enjoyable. Surprise, surprise, of course, it was a lot more enjoyable. And it's an interesting experiment, Robert, with as far as like how zoomed in the narrative is, right? Like, A Song of Ice and Fire proper is all the way zoomed in. It's moment to moment, narrative you're writing around in the characters' heads. The World of Ice and Fire was very zoomed out. It was almost like a Wikipedia sort of entry of history, whereas this was sort of in the middle, where George is dropping in for little bits of dialogue. He's letting you sit with some of the characters long enough for us to really get to know them and for them to start to become three-dimensional. Like you were saying, Jaehaerys and Alysanne is the best example. He really slows down the pace with them, and we start to really get to know these characters. But there's other characters you get to know too. Like, I feel like Visenya is starting to become really three-dimensional now. Like, with everything we've learned about her, she's a lot more interesting than she used to be. And there's some of the other Targaryen queens and princesses that were really interesting too. And I found the story of Aegon III to be very sad. So, it's zoomed in enough for you to get the heart and conflict of the characters, which is really what Martin's after. So I just really enjoyed the overall pace of it and thought it was a good read.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think For me, the stars were the female characters. I think in a lot of what we've had before, it's been quite male-centric. It's been a list of kings and what happened under the rule of different kings. And this, we had a lot of the female characters coming to the fore. We had clear indications about, as you talked about, Visenya was a very strong character going in here. We had a queen who sat on the throne for 6 months but effectively got wiped from history. We had the Dance of the Dragons was 2 queens who were struggling with each other, and there are so many of the pivotal moments, the kind of the WTF moments about this book were to do with the female characters rather than the male. So I think for me that was one of the big takeaways. The other thing that I would say, just to sort of head this all up, is just a reminder. I said this last week, I'll say this again this time. This is not written in the third person omnipotent kind of perspective point of view. This is written from the perspective of a Maester. So everything we see here is written from that perspective. And so we shouldn't take this as completely accurate history in as much as it's the truth, as it were. We should see this as one person's take on history. So everything that we see about all of the different characters is one person's interpretation of whether they were a good person or a bad person. And Archmaester Gildane clearly has an agenda going into this. But I was going to start off with a couple of questions from my patrons. They kind of dotted around a bit. So apologies, LML, in advance for sort of moving around the text quite a bit. But we're going to start off with 2 of the, again, we were talking about the female characters, two of the key female characters, the twins, Aria and Rhaella. Now, what happened there was quite clearly a swap between the 2 of them. So the one of them was incredibly vivacious and outgoing and interested in the world. Another was very bookish, and the one gets sent down to Old Town to sort of just study and just like go away as a scepter, and the other one stayed up at Dragonstone. And then there came a moment where they seemed to have got swapped. Now, this meant that everything we have as area in the sort of the second bit of the narrative, we're always thinking, oh, is that actually Aria or is that Rhaella? We're not entirely sure. But the key point here is the swap. And Piano Diva, one of my patrons, says, I'm trying to figure out why it was hinted that the twins, Aria and Rhaella, may have switched places due to their personalities. What does that mean for the story and the symbolism, if true? Now, we've got a lot of baby swaps going on, LML, in A Song of Ice and Fire. What do you think this adds to the symbolism?
Well, it definitely does make you think, you know, that's the way I like to analyze the story, is by looking at, well, we've got a lot of baby swaps, so let's compare them all and see what we can find. The thing is that I didn't find an exact one-to-one correlation for that. So I don't have a dead ringer parallel. I thought that was more of an interesting story thing, and I definitely think they were swapped. But one does think of Jon Snow, for example. He swaps. Obviously, he was sort of a secret baby himself, although I don't know if he was swapped for anybody. But specifically, I think about when he swaps Monster and Mance Rayder's son, because he even has a dream about it, where he like cuts the heads off of both babies and then like sews them back on the other body. So it's like, it's something he thinks about a lot. I'm not sure if there's a direct parallel to that. You think of like, so one girl ended up in the Citadel in or not the Citadel, but in the Starry Sept, I guess, right? She became a Septa. And then the other one is Aria, the girl who burned to death with the worms and all that, right? So those could be implied as like an ice and fire fate, right? Like Aria's fate is all fire. She's consumed with these fiery worms, and I'm sure we'll probably talk about that. But the other girl goes into the Faith of the Seven, and the Faith of the Seven has a lot of covert ice symbolism when you start breaking things down into ice and fire. Like they've got all these crystals and white marble, snowy white marble, sometimes even veined with blue. And I've actually developed that quite a bit. Like here's an interesting tidbit for you, Robert. The warriors, the warriors' sons, right? The faith militant, the soldiers that we see in A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons. Cersei reconstitutes the faith of the seven, and we see these soldiers. They have the warriors' sons and the poor fellows, all right? So the warriors' sons are actually symbolic stand-ins for the others, Robert. Their sigil, check it out. Their sigil is a crystal sword on a field of black, which is exactly what the others have. They hold crystal swords in the darkness, right? Then we have their armor, which is polished to a, quote, mirror-like shine. And mirror armor is essentially what the others have. They have ice armor, but it works like a mirror and it reflects everything around them. And then there's, what was the other thing? Oh, and then they have crystal stars in their swords. The thing is, the others also have icy star symbolism because they have cold burning star eyes. And crystal is a word that's used to describe ice a lot of times. Like this other swords are crystal. The wall is described as crystalline. So what George is doing is he's using the warrior's sons essentially as a symbolic proxy or a stand-in for the others. So when you see the warrior sons walking around and doing stuff, it's actually clues about what the others do. And so that symbolism runs all through the Faith of the Seven. It's all a bunch of ice symbolism. And that's why, for example, in King's Landing, you have the Hill of Rhaenys, and on there is the Dragon Pit, which is a bunch of fire symbolism. And then you have the Hill of Visenya, which has the white marble sept of Baelor. So it's kind of an ice fire, white and red thing going on. And so that's possibly, if we're looking for symbolism in the baby swap, I'm seeing one child who dies in fire, almost like a parallel to the Dragon Pit, and the other child becomes a septa in a parallel to the Hill of Rhaenys, which I believe is an ice and fire pattern. Hope that was easy to follow.
Yeah, no, I like that a lot. I think that the 2 points I would take from that. The first one is it's quite a high level point to say that when we're talking symbolism within Fire and Blood and A Song of Ice and Fire more generally, what we're not doing is saying, well, here's one thing that happened, another thing is going to happen exactly the same way. That's not how this seems to work. That's not how George R.R. Martin seems to work. What he does is he creates kind of things that echo through history. So we have this idea of the baby swap clearly echoes through history. We've got 2-3 examples within A Song of Ice and Fire. Here is another one. It would have been astonishing, I think, if we hadn't had any baby swaps within Fire and Blood. So I think that this is quite clearly the one that's going on there that is quite central. So the second point is this creation of the idea of the Faith of the Seven as being ice. And I think this is a fantastic point. It's something I've been thinking through a while, but I think you've articulated this really well. So they are being the opposition to fire, and they have been the opposition to fire, the dragons, all the way through Fire and Blood. We get this ongoing battle. Sometimes the faith sort of acquiesce and they go along with what's happening with the Targaryens, and sometimes they oppose them forcibly. But you know that in an ideal world they would not allow what is going on. It is just a pragmatic thing when they sort of take the step back. So I love this idea that we get the symbolism of the Faith of the Seven as being ice against the symbolism of the Targaryens as being fire. So I think that's got us off to a really good start. We had a couple of super chats come through. Oldman Shredder, great name, with 100 SEK. I'm not entirely sure what that is, but thank you very much for the donation. A thing I wondered about is the lack of material progress in Westeros over time if we compare to medieval history. 150 years is a long time. Just things like armor should develop fast in a warlike world. Yeah, this is something that a lot of people have noted, and the main answer, and I'll be very happy to have your thoughts on this one as well, NML, is that the main answer is that the knowledge within Westeros has been concentrated within the Citadel, within the Maesters. They're the people who teach everyone everything, and they hold on to the knowledge. Now, it's not just the 150 years that we see here in Fire and Blood. It is the thousands of years that have been happening. And if anything, there seems to have been a backslide in technology. The old castles like Storm's End, like the High Tower, these things have been there for thousands of years. They are still the strongest and most redoubtable constructions in the entire world. So if anything, there's been a backsliding. So yes, it's noticeable that there has been not as much progression as perhaps there might have been. And the places that have progressed in technology seem to be places like Braavos, where we hear about their arsenal where they make ships. They can make a warship in a day, apparently. This seems to be huge progress. And these are the places that have deliberately turned their back on not just the kind of the Westerosi Maester world, but also the Valyrian world as well. So there is progress being made across the piece, just not so much in Westeros. But LML, have you got any thoughts on that one?
Well, part of me wonders if it's just George's need to have it feel medieval. You know, there might not be a real good reason. I think that's very possibly a lot of the answer. Like, he just wanted Westeros to be medieval. Also, I guess, you know, if you look at the Middle Ages, you know, a lot of it was the Dark Ages. And elsewhere in the world, like in the Middle East specifically, science and mathematics were very advanced at the same time that Europe was going through the worst part of the Dark Ages. So I think that's the feel that he's intending to mimic in our current time. But I don't know that that answers the question of why Westeros has been sort of, you know, held in check all this time and why they haven't advanced. I don't know. I don't see an obvious reason. Maybe it's a Bloodraven conspiracy or Maester conspiracy, but I don't see the pieces there for a good meaty theory about that. So I apologize for not having a better answer.
No, I mean, I think for me, I would actually turn the question around slightly. I think the question I would ask George R.R. Martin is not why have you not had technology advance? It is why did you have such huge periods of time? He could have told the same story, from my mind, with what we've seen so far. He could have told the same story if the pact, if the others, whatever had happened 1,000 years ago or a few hundred years ago. That wouldn't make, to me, huge amounts of difference. But he added in these huge chunks of time, and I can see one thing there, which is that it allows the stories of those times to turn into legends. But beyond that, it doesn't quite work for me. And I think that that is one of the things that we will learn when we get to the last two books, is why there is this huge gap. That, for me, is the bigger issue rather than the technology. I think I would agree with you. I think he wanted to have a medieval-esque world. And in order to do that, he had to have limited advance in technology. But we did have another super chat as well. So let's quickly go across to there. Coulter Grayson, thank you so much. $10. That's very kind. What I learned is if you get pregnant by a Targaryen, there's a 99% chance you're going to die in childbirth. Also, you're more likely to be king if you're second or third born child than the first. Well, yeah, I don't think I would disagree with that. I mean, 99% is slightly overstating it, but one of the many things that came out from this is that there are lots of Targaryens in this. There are lots of extra names to learn. There are lots of marriages. There are lots of illegitimate children. Lots of people do indeed die in childbirth. And if we take that across to Song of Ice and Fire, that's a very clear theme when you get Jon and Dany and Tyrion all linked by that, among many other kind of things. The second or third born inheriting is very clear through the family tree in Fire and Blood Part 1, but it's not just there, it carries on all the way through to the second half, Fire and Blood Part 2, when we see Aegon V, Egg from Duncan Egg, was known as Aegon the Unlikely because he was so far down the line of succession that nobody thought he would ever inherit. This is a function of the fact that it is a bloody world, and that not only were the Targaryens fighting each other because they did not have an understanding of what, or a clear agreed understanding of what the line of succession was, and that I'm very happy to talk about that a little bit more, but that for me is one of the big takeaways. They did not know and agree who should take over because they didn't have an understanding of what seemed later to turn into male preference primogeniture, which is the kind of thing that the monarchy in England has, but it doesn't. It wasn't the case early on, and that's why they had so many battles between them. But also there were also innumerable revolts that we didn't see all of these previously, but then suddenly in Fire and Blood we see seemingly every few years somebody else rebels against the throne, and therefore lots and lots of people die. But LML, did you have any thoughts on that kind of overarching thing about why either why there are so many people dying in childbirth, or why the firstborn doesn't often inherit?
So the childbirth thing is definitely Martin developing the theme of the Targaryens being kind of unnatural. It's that whole fire of the gods thing. Like they apparently, I believe the Valyrians in the ancient past performed really dark acts of blood magic experimentation to create what we know as the blood of the dragon to enable them to bond with dragons. And for the most part, George is kind of frowns on that sort of thing. And so he sort of depicts it as this like unstable thing. I mean, his favorite thing is to show the cost of magic, right? So the Targaryens' pursuit of this dragon magic, it results in weird lizard babies. Half of them come out crazy. They apparently think they need to practice incest in order to keep that genetic bloodline alive. And then if they try to put their seed in other women, then a lot of times it goes really poorly for those women. So that's essentially George. I mean, it sort of fits with the whole Targaryen thing. And it shows that they're like almost half monster, if you will. And the same message with the lizard babies. Like these people are kind of monsters. And of course the Valyrians were actual monsters, feeding people to their slave pits for, hundreds and thousands of years. So the second question was what? What was the second part of it, Robert?
The second question was about why it is that the firstborn often doesn't inherit. Why that if you look down the family tree, it's very obvious in Fire and Blood Part 1 that the firstborn child doesn't seem to inherit. It's often the second or third, so it turns into quite a complicated family tree. Why isn't it that the obvious person? Why is it that the obvious person does not often inherit?
So I think you just answered the question. It makes for a more complex and tangled story. And that's the kind of the story that George wants to tell. That's part of the answer. The second answer is that I think he's somewhat mimicking, real history where frequently, a lot of people die. It's just a rougher life. People die more often, and frequently the question of succession is thrown into question. But I mean, you see what a great plot device the succession is, right? Like as soon as the succession is thrown into question, all bets are off. So that gets to be really interesting. I also think I joke about George hating quarterbacks, if you will, the quarterback type, the tall, handsome, preening, cocky, the Theon type, even Robb Stark. Like these characters always get knocked down many, many pegs, and frequently they die in horrible, brutal ways. And I just think George is into the crippled bastards and broken things and second sons and underdogs. And I just think that's what he identifies with. So, and the other thing I would say about, earlier you were talking about the strong female characters and the question of the stability of rule. And I think it's George basically, he's giving us primogeniture and stuff, but when everyone has dragons, you have to consider that as an X factor. Like now the cousin or brother or queen who never was, they got passed over. Like if they're sour about how things went down, well, guess what? They're a dragon rider. So it's pretty easy to start your own rebellion. And we see in the dance, once a lot of the dragons die, it's like anybody that has even one dragon can claim legitimacy and power that nobody else has. There's such a force, you know, equalizer. So I think that's one of the interesting things about the Targaryen history is that it's messed up because anybody that's a dragon rider can cause a lot of problems, even if she's like a 10-year-old girl or anything like that. So
yeah, I think I would agree with all of that. We had another couple of super chats coming in that I just want to quickly pick up on. The first from Michelle Kalen, $10. Thank you so much. That's very kind. Saying, wouldn't you love to read A Caution for Young Girls? Now, for those who haven't read Fire and Blood yet or only part way through it, that's absolutely fine. I just, for the record, I'm very aware that a lot of people haven't yet, and there are spoilers here, I know that, but I get the feeling most people don't mind that with Fire and Blood. But one of the things which comes again and again is because this is written from the perspective of Archmaester Gyldain, he is writing it as a history book, and he's always quoting other books. Now, one of these is a Caution for Young Girls, I think it was called, which was a book which was allegedly written by, and I suspect that LML is the kind of guy who taps a few keys and will immediately come up with a quote. I think it was Corianne Wilde, who is one of the sort of the more obscure characters in this, who has some terrible things happen to her, and writes this apparently writes this autobiography to caution other young women about what all the ills are in the world. I agree. I would love to read that. I would love to read all of the other things that are name checked here, but the one I would love to read the most is whatever Mushroom was writing. Mushroom is, for me, one of the standout characters in this, who we hardly see at all in the actual narrative, but gets quoted a lot. He was a fool during the reign of, I think, 4 different monarchs, and he has written this history, which is Archmaester Gyldain is always being slightly looking down his nose at and saying this is very base. It's always just looking at the worst in humanity, and it's ribald, and it's just overtly sexual in every way, and yet he keeps on quoting it. Which seems to imply that there's a huge amount of truth going on in there. And that, for me, is the one that I would most, perhaps this says a lot about me as a person, but I would much rather read that than the sort of the more cautionary tales. Everything in this world is written from someone's perspective, but I suspect that there's probably slightly more truth in the person who is telling the slightly more licentious tales than the person who is telling the cautionary tales, if that makes sense. Which out of the many different other histories that we read about would you most like to read, LML?
Oh, well, I mean, I'd go straight for Colloquo Votar and the Jade Compendium, but that's because I'm a big nerd. The Caution for Young Girls is a hilarious inclusion in Fire and Blood. It's definitely a lot of fun. I almost interrupted you to say, I held myself back, but I almost interrupted you to say, isn't it funny how well this Maester knows A Caution for Young Girls? And, you know, it's like, well, he's read the book a few times, hasn't he? Alone in the dark cell in the Citadel with a bunch of other dudes. It's like, yeah, I think everybody has this book. It's basically like kind of like porn in a sense. I mean, it's a smut, essentially, you know, the Westerosi version of smut. So it's hilarious. It's fun to talk about. Mushroom, dude. I mean, how long does that guy live? He seems to wend his way through like the entire book almost. You wonder after a while, like, how old is this guy? But he's definitely a clever fool, as Patchface would say. He's somebody that did the whole routine of pretending to be silly and dumb and was actually quite clever and was writing down a lot of things and remembering a lot of things. And he's actually, you can see him manipulating events a few times even, especially with Rhaenyra during the Dance with the Dragons. So I thought that was interesting. Yeah, Mushroom is definitely a standout character. And he's got some good symbolism too, I suppose.
Well, maybe we'll come back to the symbolism of Mushroom. I think for me, he's one of the characters that I most enjoyed in this. We didn't read about him. We read about his views on other people a lot more. And I think, if anything, that makes me slightly more fascinated. Chicken Lipstick, thank you so much. $5. Thank you for all your hard work, great ideas, and lovely voices. You are very welcome. Thank you so much for that super chat. Let's quickly go back to questions from my patrons. Sarah O'Connor, or possibly Sarah O'Connor. We've corresponded a few times, and I still don't know if you're Sarah or Sarah, so apologies. What can we learn from how the different royal progresses are viewed and described? A point of fascination for me is how Robert Baratheon is criticized for setting up a small council to rule in his stead when he traveled to various locations. But with Aegon the Conqueror, who traveled with over 1,000 knights, lords, and ladies, he doesn't have so much condemnation. I think there are quite a few different answers to this one. The first one, I think, is that Aegon the Conqueror is given quite an easy ride by Archmaester Gildain. Through this, he's being seen as because Archmaester Gildain is very pro-Targaryen rule, it would appear. You have to remember, he is the guy who we previously saw as being the Archmaester at Summerhall when there was the tragedy at Summerhall. Now, for him to be the Archmaester at Summerhall, which was a place for the Targaryens, it was probably their third main place after King's Landing and Dragonstone. This was probably where the next in line was sort of had their home base. For him to be there seems to imply that he must have been in with the Targaryens. And a lot of this, particularly when we came to King Jaehaerys, the language is incredibly supportive. And when we get to Aegon, the language is also very supportive, because he is the cornerstone of the Targaryen right to rule. If you view him as being this foreign invader, then suddenly the whole thing comes crashing down around your ears. If you see him as this great hero who comes in and unites the Seven Kingdoms, suddenly the Targaryen rule is authorized. So I think there's that. In terms of the progresses themselves, I don't know the exact criticism of Robert Baratheon for appointing a small council to do that, but him going up to Winterfell took months, like 6 months to get up there. It was a long and hard process, and actually having a small council ruling in a king's stead was not rare. This happened quite a lot of the time. We see it in Fire and Blood. Cregan Stark, as Hand of the King, was effectively ruling for half a year or so. We had a lot of small councils who were there. We had people, when there was a young Targaryen on the throne, there were people who were ruling there as regent for them. So the king being absent and other people ruling is not generally seen as a bad thing. But LML, did you have any thoughts on the progresses more generally?
I thought they were an interesting narrative device, and it was a good way to show. I feel like it was something that Martin used to distinguish like which rulers were good. Like Aegon III, although he was a sympathetic character, wasn't an effective king because he stayed in the Red Keep and didn't go out and see and talk to the people. And it was one of the redeeming aspects of Aegon the Conqueror that he did do that. He allowed the local lords and local people to retain as much of their local customs as he could, which is kind of like a high point of the Roman Empire kind of tactic. And then, these progresses he sort of shows you, like he talks about the dragon lords, whether or not they make overt threats or not. For example, like some of the bad kings would pull the Joffrey, to say, I am the king, I have dragons, I will kill you. And it's like Tywin says, A real king doesn't need to say he's king. And Aegon and some of the other good Targaryen kings, they implemented that with their dragons. They didn't make overt threats. They came by in a friendly manner with their giant fire-breathing dragons and shook your hand and was like, oh, yes, everything's nice. You're doing a great job here. Keep it up. You know, attaboy, Balerion, you know, down boy. It's like, gets the point across. And it makes, it allows the lords to retain their pride, is what I'm trying to say, instead of forcing them to debase themselves and, you know, lording over them. It's a non-violent means of reinforcing Targ dominance, as Bale the Bard says. Yes, that's exactly what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I agree. So I think that the progresses actually showed us the kings and the queens around the continent, not just what was happening in King's Landing. So they were a really important part of that, and they were an important part in establishing how the king ruled. So we see with Jaehaerys and Alicent, they go out, and Alicent herself goes and meets all the women and has these women's councils and all the rest of it, and that leads to changes in the law because she actually meets real people. Aegon, it's seen as very much a huge thing of him heading out across with his dragons and his hundreds of lords and all the rest of it. It was a show of power. So it's, as much as anything, the progresses were intending to show us what the monarch was like, not just a kind of like a, it was a way to hang cool stories off of it, but it was just to show us what the character of that particular monarch was like. We had a couple of other super chats. Andrew K saying, not done, $5. Thank you so much. Not done with Fire and Blood yet, but anything new to expand on with Alice Rivers from the book, which is probably the right time for me to say that there are a lot of characters in this. And if you've not got this far, then do not worry, because there are so many new characters we're being introduced to. And the thing that I'm looking forward to probably more than anything else is the fact that when I've read this through, and I've read it all the way through and then I've started again, is I will have missed stuff. LML will have missed stuff. Other people will have missed stuff, but another person will have spotted stuff we haven't and will have got extra layers. And it's the discussion that I'm really looking forward to, the chance for us as a community to come together and get to the real heart of where the points are that George R.R. Martin is kind of hinting that we should be taking more seriously. So Alice Rivers is one of those characters. That's all a slightly long preamble to the fact that Alice Rivers is one of those characters that I've not studied in depth yet. But for those who don't know who she is at all, she was a character who appears roughly around the time of the Dance with Dragons, and she is one of the many mysterious kind of figures. She's bastard born, as per her name. She's one of many mysterious figures that we have. And again, another part of Gildane's approach seems to be to treat a huge amount of women that he doesn't quite understand as being sorcerers or magical in a kind of a dodgy way. It's quite sinister the way that he quite often kind of like damns with black magic women that he doesn't like. But she is a character who we sort of see the edges of. She appears around Harrenhal, and she has a small impact on the Dance with Dragons. But LML,
I got a quote pulled for you here.
More bit detail here.
Yeah, I got the quote, and it's a fun one. It's worth reading. So the fourth and last for our purposes of these remarkable women emerged from the twisted towers and blasted keeps of Harrenhal, that vast ruin beside the water of the God's Eye. Shunned and forgotten since Daemon Targaryen and his nephew Aemond had met there for their final flight, Black Heron's accursed seat had become a haunt of outlaws, robber knights, and broken men who sallied forth from behind its walls to prey upon travelers, fisherfolk, and farmers. A year ago they had been few, but of late their numbers had grown, and it was being said that a sorceress ruled over them, a witch queen of fearsome power. When these tales reached King's Landing, Sir Tylan decided it was time to reclaim the castle. This task he entrusted to a knight of the King's Guard, Sir Regis Groves, who set out from the city with 100 seasoned men. At Castle Derry, he was joined by Sir Daemon Derry with a like number. Rashly, Sir Regis assumed this would be more than sufficient to deal with a few squatters. Arriving before the walls of Harrenhal, however, he found the gates closed and hundreds of armed men on the battlements. There were at least 600 souls within the castle, a third of them men of fighting age. When Sir Regis demanded to speak to their lord, a woman emerged to treat with him, and with a child beside her. The Witch Queen of Harrenhal proved to be none other than Alice Rivers, the base-born wet nurse who had been the prisoner and then the paramour of Prince Aemon Targaryen, and now claimed to be his widow. The boy was Aemon's, she told the knight. His bastard, said Sir Regis. His true-born son and heir, Alice Rivers spat back, and the rightful king of Westeros. She commanded the knight to kneel before your king and swear him the sword. Sir Regis laughed at this, saying, I do not kneel to bastards, much less the base-born whelp of a kinslayer and a milk cow. What happened next remains a matter of some dispute. Some say Alice Rivers merely raised a hand, and Sir Regis began to scream and clutch his head until his skull burst apart, spraying blood and brains. Others insist the widow's gesture was a signal, at which a crossbowman on the battlements let a bolt fly that took Sir Regis through an eye. Mushroom, who was hundreds of leagues away, has suggested that perhaps one of the men on the walls was skilled in the use of a sling. Soft lead balls, when slung with sufficient force, have been known to cause the sort of explosive effect that Grove's men saw and attributed to sorcery. So the best part of this is after there's a fight and the men are put to rout, it says, next day, a 33rd made his appearance. Having been captured with a dozen others, he had been forced to watch them die by torture, one by one, before being turned loose to deliver a warning. I'm to tell you what she said, he gasped, but you can't laugh. The widow put a curse on me. Any man of you laughs, I die. When Sir Daemon assured him that no one was going to laugh at him, the messenger said, Don't come again unless you mean to bend your knees, she says. Any man who comes near her walls will die. There's power in them stones, and the widow's woken it. 7 save us all. She has a dragon. I seen it. The name of the messenger is lost to us, along with the name of the men who laughed. But someone did, one of Lord Derry's men. The messenger looked at him, stricken, then clutched at his throat and began to wheeze. Unable to draw breath, he was dead in moments. Supposedly the imprints of a woman's fingers could be seen upon his skin as if she had been in the room choking him. And what's crazy about that is that this death is a recorded historical event. It happened in King's Landing with a bunch of witnesses around. So it's one of those things where, like, we've got a provable instance of some very powerful sorcery going on here being attributed to Alice Rivers. It seems like she really did kill him remotely, and she probably did have Aemon's bastard. I mean, that's totally believable. So this is a pretty interesting figure here.
Yeah, and I think to sort of move on the theme, Chicken Lipstick, $5 super chat, thank you so much, asking if we've touched on what Maegor might have been doing or setting in motion while he was exiled in Pentos for those 5 years. So Maegor, before he became king, he went off in exile effectively for 5 years over to Pentos before coming back to, in his view, I suspect, save the day, riding atop his dragon. And while he was there, he met a woman called Tiana of the Tower. Now, Tiana became his wife, one of 6 wives he eventually had. And she is another one of these characters, these female characters who are, within this narrative, kind of painted as magic users, sorcerers, and the like. And she even, when she becomes queen, she even admits, perhaps under torture, that it was her who cast a spell on some of his other wives to make sure that his children with them turned out to be monsters. This kind of thing we saw with many Targaryens, that they give birth not just to human babies, but babies with slightly dragonish features, with wings and tails and all the rest of it. So the short answer, I think, to that, in terms of what he was doing over in Pentos, was that he was meeting this woman and falling under her spell, either literally or metaphorically, and then brought her back. I don't think that he was setting in place any huge plans. I think that what he was doing while he was over there was biding his time and waiting for the moment, because he was convinced that because he was a strong Targaryen and that he would be able to take over when the whole thing went to pot, which he thought it would back in Westeros. He thought the Targaryen dynasty without him would probably fall because it was weak. And this is again another one of the themes which runs through Fire and Blood, is that there are some strong Targaryens and there are some weak Targaryens. At least this is how Gildain wants us to look at it. There are some who are true and there are some who are not up to the task. Did you have anything else to add on Maegor and what he might have been up to?
No, nothing in particular there. No, I think Maegor is actually very comparable to Aemond One Eye in that they both seem to have a very destructive bent to their personality. They don't do a lot of planning. They just kind of want to burn and break things.
Yeah, I think so. Maegor, I think, is as bad as he is made out. That actually is one of the questions from one of my patrons. Let me see if I can quickly find it. Oh yeah, Natalie Donald. I've often wondered if Maegor was a little misunderstood. After all, if not for him, the Targaryen reign could have been over not long after it started. Any thoughts? I think my overarching thought is that Maegor was not misunderstood. He was strong. There's no denying that. He was a very, very forceful character, but he was in our current world sort of word usage, he was a dictator and he was a cruel one. He killed thousands of people unnecessarily simply because he wanted to, and he wanted to keep his secrets. So Maegor was a bad king. Many of the Targaryens, I would argue, were indeed bad kings. They were not looking out for the best for the people they were ruling. But Klaus Richter, thank you so much. 20 euros, very generous. Thank you for that. Just saying, unfortunately, I cannot follow your live stream anymore because it's late here and I have to work today. And Klaus, I think you're in Germany. I think that's an hour later than me, so it must be coming up to 1 o'clock there. But thank you for sticking with us that long. I just want to support you. Have fun with LML. I always have fun with LML. So thank you for that. We did have another super chat. I'm just trying desperately to find it, which was from Jace, $10. Thank you. Thank you to both of you and the rest for helping us to fully appreciate these novels. Can you tell us about your backgrounds and talk about how you approach new GRRM material, how you organize all this material? That's a great question. So in terms of my approach, and I think we talked about this actually last time you were on LML, is one thing I really appreciate is how we come at the stories from different angles. That I am very much a person who comes from the narrative and from the plot and from the character-driven stories, and I try and understand it from that perspective. And LML, I'll let him talk for himself in just a moment, but comes a lot more from the kind of the thematic elements, from the overarching. We talk about the mythical astronomy, but what are the symbols that we can kind of draw and down, understand the story from the top down. So it feels to me as if I come bottom up, and LML comes top down, and we kind of meet in the middle. And I suspect we probably both agree on a huge amount, actually, about the fundamentals of this story. But how would you? The word used there was organize. How do you organize your understanding of all of this?
Well, I listen to it just like anyone else, in that I, enjoy the story, especially the first time through. But I'm always sort of in the back of my mind looking for those patterns. A 12+1 group. I'm looking for ice to fire symbolism. I've studied the symbolic motifs in the series so much that they're always in the back of my head, and I just recognize them when I see them. So essentially, I always refer to it as like a holographic effect. So there's the surface level story, and you're coming along and you're reading it, and all of a sudden this extra shape pops out of the text, and you get the second layer of symbolism that pops out, and you can see Martin creating a story within a story, if you will. And that's really exciting. That's always when my brain starts popping, and I frequently will rewind back a couple minutes and listen to it again, and so I can just sort of catch the details of what's going on. With this one, I only had like 5 days to try to read it all. I basically had it in my headphones on audiobook the whole time, and then on my phone I was just had a doc open and I was just jotting little notes down as I was reading it to sort of come back. So that's how I do it. You know, I've got that sort of holographic thing going on, and a lot of times it's easy to see that stuff on the second read is when you catch the deeper stuff. So I'm looking forward to reading it a second time at a more leisurely pace.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that in terms of the second reading. Certainly, I think like a lot of the creators and probably quite a few of you guys in the chat, I read through the first time very quickly, and I found it useful. I was actually live tweeting for the first half of the book, at least. I was live tweeting my thoughts as I came across them, and my thoughts are generally quite random. When I just saw a thing and I got, oh, that's quite interesting. Whether it was just a thing that I thought was really cool, something that that amused me, like for example the fact that going from King's Landing to Old Town on Dragonback was described as being a very long journey, that they had to take a break in halfway and have an overnight stay. Just comparing that to Dragonstone up to the Wall amused me for thinking about season 7, for example, that kind of thing. But I just, like, when I had a thought, I would just jot it down, and that was the way I approached the first one. My second read through it is a lot more treating it as a story, trying to understand and get into it, and see the characters who you see the endings of them, and then you go, oh, they were important. It's great being able to look back at the beginnings of them. So we're talking about Arya and Rhaella with the baby swap. I didn't think that was important to start with, but then suddenly you get this whole bit of story later on with her on the back of Balerion and all the fireworms and all the rest of it. Now I'm can't wait to read again about their early years and what was going on there, and whether or not the swap was a significant moment at the time, and what that actually might mean for the other one who's left behind in Old Town. Well, so that's how I kind of approached it. Just quickly want to pick up on super chat from Tyler Wooden. Thank you so much. Saying, thanks for doing these videos. You and LML are my favorite creators for sure. Thank you. That's very kind. And one more from Julie Beth Styles saying, gonna have to pop off, but really enjoying this conversation. Thanks. Thanks, y'all. I can never say y'all in a convincing accent, but thanks. And I'll be back to re-listen. That's very kind of you. $10 is very generous. As always, about halfway through these live streams, I just want to take a moment to let people know what I'm going to be doing over the course of the next few weeks on this channel. As I've said before, I'm going to focus a lot of my attention for the next few weeks on Fire and Blood. My first Fire and Blood video, not just a live stream, but a video, will be coming out, I hope, on Sunday. That's just going to be my top takeaway points. I think I've got something like 10 takeaway points that I just want to just set out. And then after that, I'm going to do a series of videos on the key questions that I've been seeing coming out from the community. They're kind of the things that people are always asking. Like, what was in that letter to Aegon Targaryen that made him call off the war against Dawn? What did happen to Arya Targaryen with all the fireworms and all the rest of it? These questions, I'm going to be doing videos, possibly short videos, sometimes longer videos on each of these key questions over the course of the next few weeks. For those who have tuned into my second channel, The Well Told Tale, you will know that we've just finished Frankenstein. This, for those who don't know, it's me reading what I consider to be the finest science fiction and fantasy stories ever written. It's just pure audio narration of stories, that channel. And we've just finished Frankenstein, and I've done a short story, a short story, which is a Conan story called The Tower of the Elephant, which is one of the early Conan stories, and a story we see him in a slightly different light, I have to say, so I really like it. And then after that, we're going to be doing, on the lead up to Christmas, we're going to do A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, which is clearly a classic and a fantastic story. The other thing I would say, patrons, thank you. I say this every time. I cannot do this without you. For those who are interested in supporting the channel, or if you want to get access to some patron-only stuff, I'm doing some audio narrations for my patrons for the pre-released extracts from Fire and Blood. So if you're interested in that or getting access to any of the other stuff I do, please do go and check out my Patreon page. There's a link down in the description. But LML, how about you? What's coming up for you on your channel?
Well, I've got I've just done last week. I've just done the Fire and Blood panel with a bunch of the myth heads, and even got Aziz from History of Westeros on there on his birthday. So that's on my YouTube page if you want some more Fire and Blood coverage after this episode, and that's Lucifer Means Lightbringer YouTube page. Next week, we'll be having a follow-up Q&A to the scripted episode I did 2 weeks ago, which was called We Should Start Back, a backwards reading of the prologue of the Game of Thrones. And Robert, that was a real mind-bender. You know, like we were just talking about, I read the chapter, and I'm looking for the second layer of symbolism. It's a story within a story. For example, the Azor Ahai monomyth is a famous one. You can find the Azor Ahai pattern of a Sun King, you know, stabbing his wife with a sword or some other symbol. Sometimes it's a penis, of course. And then some sort of Lightbringer being produced. You find that pattern all over the place. You find Waymar in the prologue is an obvious last hero echo, right? He's a Night's Watch brother. He ends up alone facing the others. His sword breaks from the cold, just like the last hero's sword. He unfortunately does not get help from the Children of the Forest and does not get a new sword of Dragonsteel, but the beginning part of it is an echo. So essentially, the prologue, Robert, of course, has like as much foreshadowing as George can possibly put in one chapter. It's a standard writer's technique. The first chapter of your book, it should set the tone as far as the narrative theme. It should, you know, foreshadow, a hint at things to come, all these kinds of things, set up things that you can follow up on later. George, of course, being a great writer, has done that a lot. And what I figured out, Robert, is that the basic archetypal pattern that exists in the prologue is a mirror image from forward to back. And so you can take it and flip it around backwards and find some interesting things. And so what I've done on this episode 2 weeks ago, the We Should Start Back episode, is we essentially broke it down for symbolism going forward, and then we flipped it around and went backward. And the clue that we should do that is actually the opening lines of the book, which is, "We should start back," Garrett urged, as the forest grew dark around them. So it's like this sort of meta commentary about going forward and hitting a stopping point and then turning around and then going back and retracing your steps. And it runs all through the book. It has to do with like redemption arcs, pivot points, like death and rebirth transformation. It all feeds into this idea of we should start back, this mirroring and inverse parallel kind of thing. So if anybody's into that, if you're into James Joyce, Finnegan's Wake, George is riffing on that whole mind fuck in the prologue too. So I would highly recommend you check that one out. But what's coming up next, like I said, is a Q&A follow-up. So I did that episode 2 weeks ago. It was really dense, a bit of a mind popper, you know. And so essentially we've had time to sit with it, listen to it a couple times, and then we're going to do a Q&A this week and follow up on it. And then people are also asking me about Between Two Weirwoods, which is the discussion panel show that I host. I haven't done one of those in a few weeks just because I haven't been able to work out the dates with everyone. Robert knows I was actually trying to work out one panel with him, and there's a couple other panels that I've got in the hopper, and it just didn't happen with the holidays and stuff. But what I am going to start doing, guys, is instead of a discussion panel between two weirwoods, I'm going to do a one-on-one interview / conversation with Between Two Weirwoods. And I'm going to sit down with content creators who have a lot of material and sort of start off by, you know, interviewing them and probing them about some of their biggest theories or videos or essays or whatever they've done. Because I always, with my sort of symbolic analysis, Robert, I've always got something to add when I watch people's videos. It happens all the time with your videos. I watch your video and I'm like, ooh, there's a symbolism thing that backs up your idea here. And so this is going to give me a chance to sort of cross my analysis with other people that I think have done really good analysis. And it's also sort of just like a conversation. So essentially the first one will be with gray area. And I think that's going to be in 2 weeks. And I've been talking with Robert about scheduling one as well. So look for that coming up soon on the Between Two Weirwoods YouTube channel. And yeah, I've probably talked long enough, but you guys know where to find me. LuciferMeansLightbringer.com, Lucifer Means Lightbringer YouTube channel. So there it is.
Excellent. And I'm really looking forward to coming on. There's at least 3 different things that we're talking about collaborating together. So there will definitely be more in Deep Geek and LML crossovers coming soon. I want to pick up on some more questions from my patrons. And there are a couple here. First of all, I'll just quickly pick off Sarah O'Connor, the second question you had about whether we learn how Dark Sister was forged, as in by which dragon's fire. No, we don't get any extra information about how Valyrian steel is created in the first place, unfortunately. We do get a tidbit about the fact that we see Blackfire gets hit by dragon flame, I think it was by Valyrian's flame, and turns darker, which sort of buys into this theory that because Valyrian's flame is black, that perhaps this is a huge constituent part of what makes each individual Valyrian steel blade the color that it is, and also the, if it's not overusing the word, the personality of the blade. But we didn't get the secret of how Valyrian steel was made. But a couple of things that I would be really interested to get LML's thoughts on. From Dana the Dreamer, a patron saying, asking about the connection between the Sunset Sea sailing and to go north, you must go south. To reach the west, you must go east. Now that second bit there is what Quaithe was saying to Dany when she's talking about, she's trying to give her advice, and she says to go north you must go south, to reach the west you must go east. And there is a lot in Fire and Blood about the Sunset Sea and about heading off on big sailing journeys there. And indeed, we get at least one person who, it seems, it's hinted quite heavily, goes all the way around the world to reach Ashai, incidentally. But what LML do you think is there a symbolic link between that and the messages that Dany has been getting?
Okay, so I think what this person is asking about is a theory that we talked about on our Fire and Blood panel from this past week, and it's actually Painkiller Jane that came up with this theory. So check it out, Robert. This is Elissa Farman, by the way. This is one of the coolest parts of the book. This is definitely, it's a little short bit. It's not comparable to like the Jaehaerys and Alysanne section. But the story of Elissa Farman trying to sail across the Sunset Sea is one of the most interesting little mini stories in the book. It had me on the edge of my seat the whole way. And so essentially, she's this visionary person who dreams of, lost lands over the sea. And she was married briefly to a Targaryen. Her brother was married to a Targaryen. Was it, I forget, I got all the names mixed up. Was it Rhaena or that married
I think so, but I'll be honest, and guys in the chat are watching this. Even us content creators who do this and spend a huge amount of time, we're getting mixed up with the names in this book. So do not worry if you are as well. But yeah, I think it was. But we could both be wrong.
This woman, Farman, becomes sort of disillusioned with the Targaryen. She has essentially a lesbian romance with a Targaryen princess. Sort of ends a little bit rocky, and she decides to steal 3 dragon's eggs. Rhaena Targaryen, yeah, it was. Steal 3 dragon's eggs and essentially sell them to somebody in Braavos to raise the money to build this great ship, which she then sailed across the Sunset Sea. And the coolest thing is that they stop by Old Town, and they get the support of the Hightowers. And so one of the second or third sons of the Lord Hightower actually goes and brings some Hightower people, and they end up with these 3 ships, and they're sailing out west like Christopher Columbus or something. And they find a little rocky island way out in the Nowheresville, and they're excited about that. And some of them basically want to turn back, happy with the discovery. And Elissa Farman, she wants to keep going. And so the story ends with her sailing off into Nowheresland. But then there's one of the coolest lines in the whole story. So it says, "As for Lady Alice Westhill, born Elissa of House Farman, where her adventure ended we cannot say. The sun chaser vanished into the west, still searching for the lands beyond the sunset sea, and was never seen again." Except, and this is me on the audiobook listening to this, I'm like, except what? Except what? And it says, many years later, Corlys Velaryon, the boy born on Driftmark in 53 AC, would take his ship Sea Snake on 9 great voyages, sailing farther than any man of Westeros had ever sailed before. On the first of those voyages, he sailed beyond the Jade Gates to Yi Ti and the Isle of Leng, and returned with such a wealth of spice and silk and jade that House Velaryon became for a time the wealthiest house in all the 7 kingdoms. On his second voyage, Sir Corlys sailed even farther east and became the first Westerosi ever to reach Ashai by the Shadow, the bleak black city of the Shadowbinders at the edge of the world. There he lost his love and half his crew, if tales be true. And there as well, in Ashai's harbor, he glimpsed an old and much weathered ship that he would swear forevermore could only have been Sunchaser. And that means that she probably, or at least maybe, made it around the world and got to Ashai by going west. She went west to go east. So Painkiller Jane, one of my collaborators and myth heads, wondered if maybe Elissa Farman is Quaithe, because she stole the dragon's eggs that made their way to Pentos that are almost certainly the ones that Dany gets from Illyrio. Then she sails west. She goes west to go east. And then if she turned out to be Quaithe, she would then be helping Dany wake the eggs that she basically put in motion to get to Dany, and then giving her the advice, you have to go west to go east, which is exactly what she did. So pretty cool theory. There's not a ton to go on, but I don't know. I like it. It makes a lot of sense to me. So what do you think?
Well, I mean, there are 2 elements. For me, I agree that was one of the standout stories in all of Fire and Blood. And so Elissa Farman heading off west and apparently arriving at the east has huge implications, I think, because we never knew before. We kind of figured that the world was round. This isn't this world we're talking about. This is a round world, but we didn't have any real evidence. We didn't know, like nobody else knew, what happened when you went west. The moment you start thinking that this is a globe, you then get into a huge number of possibilities that we don't have time to get into here about, well, what does that mean if we're saying that the others, the White Walkers, they're in their equivalent of the North Pole? Does that mean they can just as easily come down any other way into Essos, for example, as they do into Westeros? And that adds in a whole range of questions about what might have happened in the original first Long Night and what might happen in this Long Night as well. But leaving all of that aside, in terms of whether Elissa Farman is in fact Quaithe, I mean, I like it in terms of its symmetry, but as you say, there's no evidence for this yet. I think the one thing, and this kind of picks up on the second from Dana the Dreamer's question, which is about whether or not another one of the Targaryens who ended up in, I think it was Pentos brothel, whether or not that might be linked across to Illyrio. The thing we have to remember is this is a long period of time that we're talking about here. So there is a big gap between what happened in the time of Jaehaerys and what happens in the time of A Song of Ice and Fire is 200 years. Huge amounts of things can happen in 200 years. This is generations, 6, 7, 8 generations later that we're talking. So there's a big gap going on there. And so we have to say that the relation between the people that we're talking about back then and the people we're talking about right now is actually quite tenuous in terms of actual where they come in the family tree. Now, could Elissa Farman be Quaithe? Well, possibly, but I can't see any evidence for it. Is the short answer at the moment. There might be some more coming out that we just haven't spotted yet. But what Quaithe was doing was saying that the answers that you're looking for are to the east, and in order to go west, which is where you're wanting to go, you have to go and get your answers from the east. That doesn't necessarily mean that she has to go to Ashai, and I think it's been very clear that Dany isn't going to go to Ashai. She has to get her stuff from the east. If Quaithe was wanting to say, hey, in order to go to the west, you have to use these 3 dragon eggs that I stole ages ago, then I think she could probably have just said that rather than just do that. In order to go west, you have to go east thing. I think
so Robert, the idea is like that's sort of just a narrative rhyme. It's not like a literal thing. It's just like, well, wouldn't it make sense? It'd be a certain amount of symmetry if Quaithe turned out to be the one who set those dragon eggs in motion to getting to Dany 200 years ago. And then it's sort of ironic that the sort of up is down, go east to go west advice that she's giving to Dany turns out to be what she actually did to get to Ashai. She's not like telling Dany to sail the way she did. It's just when you notice it, it's like, oh, that sort of rhymes and fits together. It's not like hard proof. It's just sort of like, oh, okay.
I get that. I think for me, in terms of the tale of the 3 eggs, the bit that chimes most with me is this idea that Braavos are actually a whole lot more involved in this than we previously thought, because what we know, have been picking out over a few years as a community, it has to be said, is exactly what's going on with the Martells and Braavos and the Targaryens and Illyrio and Varys and all the rest of it. And we've been just trying to draw all this together. And this is just, for me, this is another thread, is that Illyrio initially said, I got these from Ashai. I get the link across there. That makes a lot of sense. And perhaps he was doing some kind of poetic throwback to where the person who originally brought them came from. But as far as we can tell, what happened was they got sold to the Sea Lord of Braavos. If they weren't, then what happened next makes absolutely no sense whatsoever, because the Sea Lord then effectively forgave a huge amount of debt that the Iron Throne had to Braavos, to the Iron Bank. So we're pretty sure he had them. If he had them, the question is, what does he do with them after that? He, it would appear, then gave them or sold them off to Illyrio, who he would have known was harboring at that particular time Dany. So that brings in this whole idea that actually Braavos are wanting Dany, the Targaryens, to have the symbols of Targaryen rule, the dragon eggs, in a way that in the absence of both of the Targaryen swords and the Targaryen crown, and the fact that they couldn't get to the Iron Throne, this was as close as they were going to get to some kind of authentication of their right to rule Westeros. And so for me, the bigger thing here is an extra thread drawing Braavos and all the political machinations that are going on there to this plot to get the Targaryens back onto the throne. So that is what I think.
That's really interesting. That's really interesting. And it's well possible that Dany was the house with the red door was actually the Sea Lord's palace, because we know that the only place that fruit trees grows in Braavos is in the courts of the mighty. And even on the map of Braavos, there's specifically like a garden looking thing in the Sea Lord's palace. So the carved wooden animal pillars that Dany remembers reminds you of the fact that the Sea Lord kept a menagerie. So that sort of all makes sense. So yeah, that's really cool. I hadn't put that angle together, but you're right. And then you also have to consider the faceless men and what their political interests are. They're operating out of Braavos, and you know, they're obviously pulling a lot of strings, and they're involved with Euron, and they maybe acquired a dragon's egg from Euron. It's a big mystery as to what they want to do with that. So yeah, you're right to point the finger at Braavos and all that stuff, and say that they probably will be playing a heavy role in the next 2 books, I would think.
I agree, and I did a video on the House with the Red Door and the Lemon Tree 2 months ago or so, and I agree with you completely. I think that for the first 5 years, for 5 years of her childhood, Dany was based in Braavos, in a house in the garden of the Sea Lord's palace. I think that for me, that's not quite beyond dispute, but as close as we're going to get. I can't see any reason to argue against that. And I think that I would also agree that what we're going to see in particularly the next book in The Winds of Winter is a lot more of this plot that's going on. We saw a couple of the preview chapters that we've got from The Winds of Winter are from the Martell's perspective about what their plans are for pardon me, for getting the Targaryens back. And if you look in, and it takes quite a detailed look into Arya's chapters in Braavos, you see that there's a lot of political maneuvering going on there. So I think that we're going to see a lot more of that happening in The Winds of Winter. Pardon me. So let's quickly go on back to another. Actually, we did get a super chat. I didn't thank Kid28. Thank you so much. Just saying, no question. Always a pleasure when you two get together. Thank you. That's very kind. Questions from my patrons. We had another one, which again I think is a kind of a symbology question, but I'll have a first stab at this one, and then after that, Alaman, I'd be really interested in your perspective. Do you see, this is Dana the Dreamer again, do you see a parallel between Lyanna and Rhaegar and Sierra Snow, pardon me, sorry, Sierra Snow and Jace Velaryon? Now, this is going back to a story early on in the Dance of the Dragons. We get this character called Jacaerys Velaryon, who heads up north on a dragon to try and drum up support for one side, for the Blacks. And he visits, first of all, the Vale, and then he goes across to, I think, White Harbour, and he ends up in Winterfell. And we get lots of stories of what happened there. A lot of them, again, from Mushroom, who seems to know a lot about what was happening. And clearly, Jacaerys Velaryon and Cregan Stark, the Lord of Winterfell at the time, got on really well. And they struck what was called the Pact of Ice and Fire, where Cregan Stark would support them in return for there being a marriage between a Targaryen princess and one of the Starks. That never actually happened, but Cregan Stark did head down south after the war had finished, unfortunately, to fulfill his part of the bargain. But while they were up there, while Jacaerys was up there, two interesting things happened. The first one was allegedly his dragon Vermax, I think it was, left some dragon eggs up there, leading to a lot of the rumors about whether they might be down in the Winterfell crypt. And the rumor that he might have married one of the a bastard-born son of a Stark who was called Sierra Snow, which then means that we have this kind of ice and fire mix, Targaryen and Stark mix. So the question is there a parallel? Is there any kind of symbolic link, do you think, between and I see you've got your horns on, is there a link between those two different stories?
Yeah, sometimes post 4 o'clock and 20 minutes past the hour Pacific time, the dragon undergoes a transformation and becomes the dragon LML or something. Yeah, so basically the Pact of Ice and Fire, George is continuing to build up the mystique of what it's going to mean when Jon and Dany come together, essentially, in whatever sense that they do. He's just teasing it all the time. You know, he's showing us, you know, Targaryens and Starks almost coming together, or maybe there was a rumored relationship. It just makes you appreciate how it hasn't happened, and how when it does happen, it's going to be something amazing. It's going to be the merging of ice and fire. It's going to be this magical kind of a thing. Like in the books, especially, I don't think Jon and Dany will have any normal babies at all. The only kind of children they'll have would be magical children, because Jon's going to be undead and Dany is going to be even more sorceress and may not be able to have children, although we're not sure what that bleeding incident was at the end of A Dance with Dragons exactly. It's kind of mysterious. But, you know, I think that the magical ice, I mean, it's just what you think. I mean, it's RLJ. But the thing about RLJ is it's not just obviously the romantic story. It's not just two rival houses. It's also a magical alchemical wedding and an alchemical romance because of all the ice and fire magic that'll be sort of recombining. Now, I did notice one thing. When Aegon III, the Dragon's Bane, who Aziz has pointed out has a bunch of parallels to Jon Snow, when he married Jaehaera, he was essentially reconciling the two lines of the Targs, the Targaryen house, the Greens and the Blacks. He was sort of sewing up the wounds of the Dance of the Dragons. And they made a note of pointing that out. And so I was, since Aziz had already told me that Aegon III, Dragonsbane, was a Jon historical parallel in some ways, when I saw that, it stood out to me. I was like, oh, when Jon marries Dany, that will be a unification of two disparate sides of the Targ family, essentially. So there's definitely some cool stuff going on that's building up that whole ice and fire mystique.
Agreed. I think that there's it's not, again, it's not, when we're talking about parallels, when we're talking about symbolism, it's not this thing happened in history and the exact same thing is going to happen again in a Song of Ice and Fire. There's a lot of kind of foreshadowing and hints at what might happen, and sometimes it's things that nearly happen but don't will happen in a Song of Ice and Fire, and I think this is one of the things. So the Pact of Ice and Fire was a thing that should have happened a long time ago and didn't, and so it actually will happen in a Song of Ice and Fire, but nobody knows it happened. So that's the kind of the mirroring that we've got going on here. I did want to say, I spotted a while ago somebody was saying that this was their first time in the chat. I think it was Kevin Doyle. If it was, welcome. It's great to see you. I love it when new people are coming on in the chat. So I hope you're enjoying it. Couple more questions for my patrons. The first one is about talking about the Starks again, actually. Anime lover Nicole says, what are your impressions of the Starks in Fire and Blood, in particular Torrhen Stark, Brandon Snow, Alaric Stark, and Cregan Stark? Now, I think this is really interesting because the Starks are one of these families, and there are a few of them in this world of Ice and Fire who they have a clear set of characteristics that seem to run from generation to generation. And George R.R. Martin has given us this idea of what Starkishness is. They might change a little bit, so individuals are slightly different along the way, but you know what it means. If somebody's a Stark, you understand what that means. So the characters we've got going on here, particularly the ones that we get a bit more detail on, like Alaric Stark and Cregan Stark, are very Starkish. They're very, you don't see them cracking huge amounts of jokes. You don't see them heading off doing lots of fun exploring around the world. They're just doing their duty. They're doing what they ought to do. You kind of respect them, but you kind of fear them, but at the same time, you don't really love them. So I think what that tells me is that George R.R. Martin wants us to understand very clearly and strongly what Stark means, so that we will see it when, and we will recognize it when we see it. And so it's the same with the Targaryens, that yes, there's different types of Targaryens, but we know what Targaryen-ish means. We know what Starkish means. And so therefore, when we get these two families, we will be able to recognize their characters, and we can almost guess what a random Stark would be doing. But are there any kind of like archetypes that you would say come out from Fire and Blood when it comes to House Stark? You've got mute on.
Repeat that last line again.
Are there any archetypes that you've seen coming out for House Stark, specifically within Fire and Blood?
Nothing, not a new thing. I mean, the thing about House Stark that's interesting is that at first they appear, you'd think, oh, well, they're icy, they're from the north, right? The thing about Winterfell, though, is Winterfell is actually an oasis of heat amidst the north. That's kind of its notable thing, the hot springs that are like pumping blood that go through the castle. And then similarly, the direwolf symbolically is essentially the same thing as a hellhound. And you see that in Theon's dream, where he dreams of Rickon and Bran as like wolf children, and they're coming after him with like hot dripping black blood that smells of sulfur and brimstone and stuff. And essentially all the hellhound symbolism comes from Cerberus. So here's the cool thing, Robert. You're familiar with Cerberus, right? In Greek mythology, the three-headed hellhound that guards the river Styx and all that. So House Targaryen is a three-headed dragon. And there are other multi-headed dragons in mythology. But I believe that the three-headed dragon of Targaryen is largely a dragon version of Cerberus, essentially. But a one-headed version of Cerberus is what the Starks have, the direwolves. And so what I'm saying is that the Starks have like covert, fiery, hellish symbolism sort of locked inside of all the ice and snow that surrounds Winterfell. And accordingly, we get this scene where when Winterfell burns and Bran is skin changing into his wolf, and we see the famous Winterfell dragon, right? The wolf looks up and he sees a fiery serpent whose roar was a river of flame, and then it was gone. And he's basically, what it is most likely is a stylized description of Winterfell burning from a wolf's eye view. There probably isn't an actual dragon hatching. But the symbolism of a fiery dragon hatching from Winterfell, most people take as an allusion to Jon Snow, who has this hidden Targaryen heritage. Or you could think of Jon himself as this secret fire dragon hidden amongst the cold north and the Starks. And so there's a running motif about that hidden fire, hidden dragon nature inside the ice that is running all through the Stark symbolism. And so when Jon reawakens, when he unites with Daenerys, we're going to see a lot of cool ice and fire unity symbolism going on. And I think that's what the Starks are really all about, is ice and fire being together. Like the Night's Watch, you know, in closing, I'll say this, the Night's Watch, what's their big weapon? It's frozen fire, right? It's dragon glass. Frozen fire as a concept implies the idea of like fire magic that's frozen in place, because fire magic is impossible to handle. It's like, you see Melisandre talk about it. You see Beric talk about it. It consumes, it burns you. It's the sword without a hilt. But a dragon glass knife, anybody can use it. And yet it still has the mojo of fire magic. And so you can see Martin telling you, like, ice and fire mixed together creates a stabilized thing, something that you can use against the others. And that's what Jon and Dany will essentially be, is like ice and fire unified to form a real weapon that has balance.
I think that's a really strong point. I think the only other thing that I would add to that in terms of the Stark family characteristics is that whereas on one level they're seen as this very stern, honor-bound kind of family that just do what they ought to do, the characters that we have in A Song of Ice and Fire have that other level beneath it, where actually Ned is not fundamentally just about his own personal honor. Fundamentally, the thing which drove him was his love for his family. That was what led him to lie about whether he was trying to betray the king. That was what led him to be lying about Jon because he was trying to protect his family. It was about love and it was about family, and there was this extra layer that nobody ever saw. Again, we see that with a lot of other characters like Jon. Incidentally, we see that kind of lots of echoes with that. And in Fire and Blood, we get that again a few times. We see that Cregan Stark is a perfect example of this. So I talked about the fact that he had this pact and that he was going to come down and help support the Blacks. And he came down a little bit late, as it turned out. He did his thing, and this, on one level, he was there doing what he was honor bound to do, to bring a whole load of Northmen down and to take part in the war. And then when he got there, he just took over control of King's Landing, and he was looking for people to fight because he thought the war's not over. There's lots of other people that need to be fought. And then actually what happened was that the person who persuaded him to go back up north and to just chill out a little bit was and I've forgotten her first. I think it was Alice Blackwood. Apologies, that wasn't her first name. But so they had this conversation that we actually hear the whole conversation, and what persuades him to back down is her agreeing to marry him. And so suddenly we see that this character that we thought was all about doing the honorable thing, all about being firm and taking decisive action and doing the right thing, actually what mattered to him was love. It wasn't anything else. That was the thing that changed his mind. It was love. And so I think this is another example of how the Starks have a second layer underneath the layer that we think of when we think of being the core Stark characteristics. Fundamentally, they are about love and they are about family. And I think that is something which comes out very strongly in Fire and Blood. A couple of final questions from my patrons. Seneca Black asking about if there's any mention or deeper explanation of the lore that comes from Essos. Stories about the sort of the old times, the Long Night, Ashai, the Great Emperor of Dawn, and all the rest of it. I think the short answer is there's not a lot. This is focused in on Westeros because this is the story of the Targaryens. Now, we get a few snippets about what's going on in Essos at the time. We get quite a strong steer on how close. We often forget how close places like Pentos and Braavos are to Westeros, and we see the impact that they have a lot on Westerosi politics. And we hear rumors of things going on further afield, but we don't have a lot extra about the myths of what happened in days gone by. But if there's one person who I would guarantee would have picked up on any of these kind of legends of the olden times over in Essos, it would be this man who's my guest today. So, LML, did I miss anything? Are there any extra stories or hints about the Long Night or any of the ancient stories about Essos? You're muted again.
Sorry, I was just trying to be polite as I type with the chat here. Yeah, so there are some new deities. There's not a whole lot in the way of legends here. You're right, it is straight Targaryen history, but we do hear about some new deities. So it says, all this the courting kingdom might have come to accept in time, had Lady Lara, and this is about Lara Rogaire, not also insisted upon keeping her own gods. She would have no part in the worship of the Seven, nor the old gods of the Northmen. Her worship was reserved for certain of the manifold gods of Lys, the six-breasted cat goddess Pantera, Indros of the twilight, who was male by day and female by night, the pale child Bacalon of the sword, who we've heard of, and faceless Sagael, the giver of pain. So those are three new gods. We've got a six-breasted cat goddess named Pantera, just like the heavy metal band Pantera, Indros of the twilight, who's male by day and female by night, and faceless Sagael, the giver of pain. That sounds like a fun deity to worship. You want to go to church, guys? I'm actually kind of busy this week, you know, Ted. Heard some things.
Okay, I mean, I think that's really good. So yeah, there are more deities. There's also some hints that there are some other creatures. So we get a little bit more on wyverns over in the further reaches of Essos that we haven't really seen in A Song of Ice and Fire. And this, I think, kind of plays into this idea that dragons are not just a creature on their own. It's a dragon family, as it were. I don't know exactly how this works, and I suspect George R. R. Martin is not working on this on a very scientific basis, but we do get not just the dragons that we see, but we also get these wyverns or wyverns, however you wish to pronounce it, and we also get fireworms that we've been touching on a little bit without talking about huge amounts. There are lots of things that seem quite dragonish that are around there and are treated even by Archmaester Gildane as actually being there, not just a rumor. With Krakens, for example, he's quite dismissive of them. They're always just rumors of them and all the rest of it. But with wyverns, he just accepts that they're there. So there's a lot more out there in Essos than we perhaps previously realized. We had a super chat, thank you so much, from Michelle Kalen saying, the binding of ice to fire is transformation. Alchemically, as with the creation of Valyrian steel, lead to gold, to the Philosopher's Stone, Lightbringer. Any thoughts on that? So we kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, and I think LML expressed it very clearly when he was talking about ice and fire and John being in the middle. But yes, I agree. The overarching theme for me of the Song of Ice and Fire is we have ice and we have fire, and in the middle we have the balance, we have the crux of it, and John is this the dragon brought up by wolves. He is the person who on the face of it is ice but actually is fire as well. He is the conciliator, he is the balance. And so actually what we've got is the forging of a new thing between these two extremes of ice and fire, both of which can destroy the world. And in the middle we get humanity forging this new reality. So that, I think, is the kind of one of the overarching themes of what we're going on there. But is there anything you wanted to add to that kind of thematically in terms of ice and fire?
Well, when she sent in that super chat, it was at the tail end of our discussion about the whole ice and fire alchemical wedding. So I think she's sort of building on what we were talking about. And yes, I mean, that's a huge, huge thing. You know, Jojen's little speech when he's like, oh, I love the hills and I hate them both. If love and hate, if ice can burn, and if love and hate can mate. And he's sort of talking about the balance of yin and yang. And he's saying they can coexist. You can get frozen fire, or you can have burning ice. You know, the others, they always use the phrase, nothing burns like the cold. And they have these fiery star eyes that burn cold somehow. We don't even understand what that means. If it's like magical cold fire or something that George is imagining. But I think thematically it is the most important thing. It's the unity of ice and fire. It's tempering one with the other. It's having things be in balance as opposed to out of balance. And so that is the true like alchemy of what's going on, the magical sort of reaction that's happening. All through in a lot of different levels and a lot of different ways. So it's a fun thing to think about.
It is. And we've got one more fun thing to think about from my patrons. Guys, we're going to start rounding this up now. So if you've got any more questions, chats you want to just drop in there, go. Now is the time to do that. But I did promise LML before we went live, I did promise him a question about Septon Moon. So June Coates, one of my patrons, has provided this. So This question is going back to where Septon Moon is murdered. The woman who plied him with wine is heard screaming before she leaves the tent. Then she emerges looking terrified and runs away. It reminded me very much of the murder of Renly in some respects. And I thought, Shadow Baby. I don't think this sounds like a faceless men job, too noisy and too messy. But if the woman he was with planned to kill him, why would she scream? So I think this is one of these things where actually one of my first tweets when I was going through Fire and Blood was to say that there was the quote on the back of this thing here could have been written for LML when it's talking about Queen Visenya rose and stalked from the hall without the king's leave. That night she mounted Vagar and returned to Dragonstone. When her dragon passed before the moon, it turned as red as blood. And then I said that if it's almost as if that quote were written for LML. But the thing which more than anything else was written for LML was this idea about Septon Moon. So I'm just going to hand it over with the one question. And for those guys who don't know, perhaps LML, you could start by introducing who Septon Moon is. Who killed Septon Moon?
Cool. So, and I will answer the specific question about why the woman screamed before I do the whole, LML thing here. But so Septon Moon is essentially, he's a rebel. He's a rogue High Septon. He's the alt High Septon. The actual High Septon in Old Town he calls the High Lickspittle because he is acting conciliatory towards the Targaryens. And Septon Moon basically leads the poor fellows who hate the Targaryens because he sort of came to power during Maegor's rule, which obviously was, a horrific reign of cruelty and persecution and all that stuff. So, of course, there's going to be all kinds of rebellions because that's sort of the irony of being a cruel authoritarian ruler is it's actually counterproductive. You just encourage rebellions, with your atrocities. I think George actually does a good job of showing that. So Septon Moon is the leader of a rebel group, essentially. And it says, hundreds of poor fellows had been hunted down and slain, their scalps delivered to the king's men for the bounty, and that's Maegor. But thousands more still roamed the woods and hedges and the wild places of the Seven Kingdoms, cursing the Targaryens with their every breath. One band even crowned their own High Septon in the persona of a bearded brute named Septon Moon. Word reached King's Landing. No, here, let me go to the description of him. Yes, yet the greatest threat was in the south, where Septon Moon and his followers camped beneath the walls of Old Town, defended by Lord Oakhart and Rowan and their knights. A massive hulk of a man, Moon had been blessed with a thunderous voice and an imposing physical presence. So that's pretty funny, right? Like, if you haven't figured this out now, I mean, a guy named Septon Moon is actually representing the moon. So he's a massive hulk of a man. He's got a thunderous voice and an imposing physical presence. We're like, yeah, he's the moon. It's pretty imposing. It says, barefoot, bearded, and possessed of an immense fervor, the poorest fellow could speak for hours and often did. And what he spoke about was sin. I am a sinner, were the words with which Septon Moon began every sermon, and so he was. A creature of immense appetites, a glutton and a drunkard renowned for his lechery, Moon lay each night with a different woman, impregnating so many of them that his acolytes began to say that his seed could make a barren woman fertile. Such was the ignorance and folly of his followers that this tale became widely believed. Husbands began to offer him their wives and mothers and their daughters. Septon Moon never refused such offers, and after a time, some of the hedge knights and their men-at-arms amongst his rabble began to paint images of the cock of the moon on their shields, and a brisk trade grew up in clubs, pendants, and staffs carved to resemble Moon's member. A touch with the head of these talismans was believed to bestow prosperity and good fortune. So that's Septon Moon. He's a Garth figure. In case you didn't recognize a lot of that language, it's the very same language used to describe Garth the Green, the legendary horned lord, sort of green man of the mythology of the Reach. The same stuff, wandering around, makes barren women fertile. He's impregnating everyone, sowing his wild oats. People bring their daughters and wives to him to be pregnant. That's exactly the story of Garth. So that's all pretty interesting as a parallel. But of course, then he gets killed. He gets assassinated. And the big mystery is who killed him. Because what happened is, well, here, I'll just read it. Mayhaps the gods were listening, for even as the king and council argued in King's Landing, the problem was resolved in a most unexpected way. Dusk was falling outside of Old Town when Septon Moon retired to his tent for his evening meal, exhausted by a day of preaching. As always, he was guarded by his poor fellows, huge strapping axemen with unshorn beards, but when a comely young woman presented herself at the Septon's tent with a flagon of wine that she wished to give his high holiness in return for his help, they admitted her at once. They knew what sort of help the woman required, the woman required, the sort that would put a babe inside her belly. A short time passed, during which the men outside the tent heard only occasional gusts of laughter from Septon Moon inside. But then suddenly there was a groan and a woman's shriek, followed by a bellow of rage. The tent flap was thrown open, and the woman burst out, half naked and barefoot, and dashed away wide-eyed and terrified before any of the poor fellows could think to stop her. Septon Moon himself followed a moment later, naked, roaring, and drenched in blood. And then it says, he was holding his neck, and blood was leaking between his fingers and dripping down into his beard from where his throat had been slit open. It's said that Moon staggered through half the camp, lurching from campfire to campfire in pursuit of the doxy who would cut him. Finally, even his great strength failed him. He collapsed and died as his acolytes pressed around him, wailing their grief. Of his slayer, there was no sign. She had vanished into the night. So the mystery is who killed Septon Moon, and the specific question was, why is the woman screaming? So the woman could be screaming because somebody else killed Septon Moon. I mean, this whole thing sounds a lot like Renly and the Shadow Baby incident in the tent. And Tiana of the Tower was on the other side of this. Actually, no, I think she was gone by this time. I take that back. So I'm not sure who would have been, but there has been some speculation that maybe this was a magical killing, like a Shadow Baby type killing. And if it was, then you could understand why she ran out of the tent screaming suddenly. That makes a lot of sense. It could be that this woman was the killer and that she was screaming and acting terrified to throw people off. That also makes a lot of sense. That's a good way to sort of confuse everyone and get out of the situation really quick. And then the question is who killed him. So I don't really know. Some people wonder if this woman was maybe a faceless man and she is the one that did it. Or if there was some other assassin that nobody caught and that was in the tent and we just didn't catch them. They got in and out quickly. But before I go into all the crappy symbolism stuff, talk about who actually killed Septon Moon. What do you think?
Well, as with all of these things, we have to put on a Poirot hat on and ask who benefits. And the whole point is that he had built up, as was always the case, he had built up, as so many of those who professed the faith of the Seven, an army of people who were against effectively the Targaryens. There were layers there. The High Towers were involved as well, but it was against the Targaryens. And so when he went, the people dissipated, the army went. So we have to ask who would benefit from that. And the answer is that there are many people, but it was basically Targaryen sympathizers who would benefit from that. Now, that therefore, as I say, opens it up to lots of other people. I do buy this idea, that the whole dragon baby idea, that I don't actually think it was the woman who went in. I think it was something else that happened. You said you were going to talk about the screaming in a moment, but I like the idea that she was unknowingly bringing something in there that then led to his death. That kind of works for me. And someone, I think it was in the chat a long time ago, this is a complete aside, and we'll come back to Septon Moon in just one moment. But when we're talking about the faith of the Seven being opposed to the Targaryens, one thing that I think we need to think about a whole lot more is who was the shepherd, who was the person who led the attack on the dragon pit and the deaths of the, I think, 4 dragons in the end. Because if you look all the way through this, the people who are actually opposing the Targaryens were the faith of the Seven and behind the scenes, the Maesters. So that's where my conspiracy theory lies. But this was a matter of people who were pro-Targaryen. LML, why don't you tell us the overarching symbolism to do with this then?
Well, he's named Septon Moon. And then when he's cut across the neck, he runs out of the tent and he bleeds into all the campfires. So the whole idea of my basic theory, for those of you who don't know, is that the story that Dany hears of the second moon wandering too close to the sun, cracking from the heat and pouring forth 1,000 dragons is actually a story about some sort of celestial collision that results in a bunch of meteors, because meteors falling through the atmosphere, blazing fiery hot, and eventually making a very loud sound and a booming impact. Those have been remembered as dragons in world mythology all throughout history. George is also working that analogy from every angle. And so essentially this, I believe, was the cause of the long night. Some sort of celestial cataclysm. We get these magic meteors because, of course, they're magic. The comet's magic. Meteors are magic. The dawn meteor's magic. So the long night is a combination of like an impact winter with, you know, the magic fallout of a moon meteor or whatever. But the point is, moon meteors are my thing because it's these broken pieces of the moon that fall down as dragons. They're the things that cause the long night. And so they're really important. And so the cool thing about meteors is that they're called bleeding stars, right? That's what they call the comet all the time. They say that it's the color of blood. Several people say that. And so it's this bleeding star. It's a star that's bleeding out red blood in the sky. And so essentially, you can think about when the moon dies or blows up, you can think about waves of blood or bleeding stars coming from the moon. And George is also riffing on the whole concept of moon blood, which is what is like a euphemism for a woman's menstrual blood, is moon blood. And so essentially what happens is you can imagine the moon as a moon maiden. And so there's like a bloody childbirth of bleeding stars and dragon meteors going on. So there's a lot of layers to the blood metaphor I don't want to go too crazy with, but the moon blood is really important. Like when the moon dies, it bleeds metaphorically in all kinds of ways. And these bleeding stars come out of it. So we have Septon Moon. He's cut across the neck, which is a sort of a sickle, horned lord, occult sacrifice kind of a vibe. And then he's bleeding out into the campfires, which gives you the idea of the falling drops of blood being like fiery drops of blood. And you can even think about Waymar in the prologue, where his falling drops of blood were as red as fire. So it's a running motif of like blood and fire, if you will, fire and blood. It's kind of a thing, right? So that extends. The moon meteors are basically emblematic of fire and blood, to put it bluntly, I guess I would say. They're bleeding stars that are actually burning, and they're compared to dragons. And so they summarize everything that has to do with House Targaryen. So you've got this guy named Moon bleeding out into the fires. And then you've got the woman screaming. If you remember, it was Nissa's cry of agony and ecstasy that was said to leave a crack across the face of the moon. So there's this running motif of a woman's scream that happens when the moon cracks. And you see that exact thing happening here. And then the best part, Robert, is that they fight over the moon's corpse. So check this out. It says the possession of Moon's mortal remains became itself a bone of contention between two of his would-be successors. And they argue about the body, and one of them used it as a talisman to attack Old Town with. And so that gives you the idea of like people fighting over possession of these moon meteors. And of course, if you think about the myth of Dawn, where they make a magic sword that could be Lightbringer out of a meteor, it sort of makes sense for people to fight about the possession of a moon meteor, a piece of the moon's corpse. So they might be talking about Lightbringer right there. So if you want the more detail, you can check out the one on my channel where we spend like probably 20 minutes on it. But that's probably a good taste of the moon symbolism. What do you think?
Yeah, exactly. And I would highly recommend people do go and check out the video that you get straight away when you go onto LML's channel. The one that plays automatically is a really good introduction to a lot of his thinking. And I've not told him this, but I'm going to try and get him onto this channel for non-live stream for him to kind of explain and for us to discuss his core understanding of what this kind of symbology is that's going on. So that's something to look out for at some point, assuming he says yes, and I've now put him on the spot, so I don't think he can say no. But guys, I've got one. I said we'd go to the chat to try and pick up a question. We did get a super chat actually, but I want to let's see if I can quickly find out what that one is. It's Matt Miller. This is excellent because I was actually going to pick your question from earlier, Matt. $10. Thank you so much. Saying thank you both for all you do. Thank you. That's really kind. So Matt, you did a question that I'm now frantically scrolling up to try and find from a little bit earlier, where you said there seems to be a correlation between egg color and dragon color. There are some correlations between dragon color and dragon flame color. Is it always egg equals color equals flame? Now, I think this is a fantastic question because I would like to add an extra bit onto this, which is the assumed link between dragon flame and Valyrian steel, because I mentioned it a long time ago in this live stream, but when Blackfire gets exposed to dragon flame, specifically Valyrian, the Black Dread's dragon flame, which is black, that turns, it turns a darker color. So I think that we now have, as a community, and this is perhaps, I'm not answering the question so much as pushing it out there to see if there's somebody who can do this hard work, because I think that there is something here that we now have enough information that we can look at the dragon colors, we can look at the dragon flame colors, we can look at the egg colors that come from different dragons, and we can try and draw that across potentially to Valyrian steel. And I would love somebody to go and do a proper detailed analysis of this. So if there is anyone out there who who's got the eye for detail and time to do that, I would love to see that, and I will very happily discuss that on this channel if someone does that. But LML, have you got any sort of thoughts about that kind of link between dragon color and dragon flame and dragon egg color?
So yeah, I mean, they match, broadly speaking. So for example, Daenerys' 3 eggs and dragons all fit this pattern. Drogon's egg is black with red swirls, and his flame is black fire shot through with red, or black fire shot through with red and bits of gold. And so it matches his egg exactly, and his colorings are similar. It's mostly black with red appointments, essentially. Then you got Viserion, cream-colored egg with whorls of gold. We get a cream-colored dragon with golden horns and wing bones and spinal crest. And his flame is like orange and red and yellow and gold, sort of. It's not white flame. I think it might be called pale fires one time. So you get the idea that the flame is not a dark sooty flame, but a bright flame. And then you have Rhaegal, the green dragon, with bronze, and the dragon matches that. And his fire is like, it actually is described a lot of different ways. One time it's red and yellow. One time it's red and yellow and orange. It does have green shot through it, though, a couple times as well to match his green. His flame from one of the silver dragons. So it appears to pretty much line up. I mean, it seems straightforward to me in that sense.
Yeah, and I've been corrected. I actually like it when this happens in the chat by Pablo, saying it was Vagar's flame that burned Aegon's body and Blackfire. So thank you for that. There are always more clever and well-read people in the chat than there are on the panel, I generally find. Yeah, I think it's on one level, it seems instinctively to me to be straightforward, but what I think is that we've got more information now. I might be wrong about this, but I feel that we've got more information now about the wide range of dragons that we had during the Dance of Dragons, and I want it may just be me being a completist, but I would like to have an understanding about where that line is drawn, and therefore what that might tell us about the dragon characteristics, perhaps, or any kind of hint of symbolism about what they are like. Does the fact that we've got two darkish dragons in Valyrian and Drogon mean that they're more independent spirited in some way, or stronger? What is the implication of having a lighter or white dragon flame? Is that a juxtaposition to the black one? Is there something going on there? And leaping across to the show from the books, if we've got blue dragon flame, does that mean something in specifically at a more of a level than it just looks cool on screen? So that's the kind of level that I think we've got slightly more information now, and I would love to see that level of analysis going on.
The answer is yes.
I'm it's just a call out if anyone wants to do it. That would be fantastic. But guys, we're coming to the end of the live stream now. Thank you so much for all the chat. But there's a lot of horny goats have suddenly appeared in the chat, which is great. That's something that I know that LML and I both hold dearly, is the horny goat. But guys, thank you so much. LML, thank you. Do you want to just quickly let people know where they can find you on the internet?
Yeah, so it's lucifermeanslightbringer.com. It's like the hub of all things me. I always put out my scripted episodes both in a essay form and podcast and video form. If you're looking for the podcast feed, it's called Mythical Astronomy of Ice and Fire. The YouTube channel is Lucifer Means Lightbringer. And guys, I'm super easy to find because every Sunday at 3 Eastern, I have a live stream. Every week, same time. It's very easy to find. Sunday, 3 Eastern. And sometimes it's a scripted episode. Sometimes it's a panel discussion. Sometimes it's a Q&A live stream, but it's always at the same time. So you don't even, yeah, it's easy to find. So thanks a lot for having me on, Robert. And just thanks to everybody in the fandom. It was just Thanksgiving. So, you know, I'm like you, I'm very grateful for all my supporters and all the Patreon subscribers who've stuck with me for so long, making it possible to do things like this. And I can't wait. Robert, you had me at hello as far as the talking about my theory in a one-on-one setting. You just name the time. We'll do it. I'm very excited.
Excellent. And Karen Pierre, I saw you in the chat saying you'll make a spreadsheet of that thing that I was waffling about a moment ago with the dragons. I would be really indebted. I would love that. That would be fantastic. Thank you so much. Guys, thank you. If you are at all interested in supporting this channel or getting access to some exclusive Patreon-only benefits, please do check out the link to the Patreon page. It's down there in the description, or will appear in a moment magically in the end screen to this. Guys, in the chat, thank you. Everyone who did a super chat, particular thanks to you. And I will see you again same time next week. Take care, everyone.